Hello, and welcome to the Empress podcast. I am your host, Jessica, known in the online space as Jess the Empress. I started this podcast to help you be present with yourself, cope with chaos, and simplify your life. I do this by combining psychology, behavioral science, and the tarot. I have a background in mental health, specifically a master's in clinical social work from USC, and I'm a professional tarot reader. So get ready to have a nurturing, creative, and empowering experience with me as we use practical magic. Hey, hi, hello. Welcome back to the pod. It's your girl, Jess. Oh my God, I just knocked something over. You probably heard that. Happy to be here. So stoked that I get to hang out with you for a little bit today. All right, so you guys saw 666 in the headline, and I was being kind of sneaky, but we're actually not going to talk about anything crazy wild today. It is actually a rule that I follow, and I'm using the word rule in quotes for those of you that are just listening to the pod and not watching on YouTube. The reason it's in quotes is because it doesn't have to be like a hard rule that you absolutely live your life by, but it is a really useful strategy, a useful framework for helping yourself reset and get a better perspective on things going on. So let's go ahead and hop into it. So, asking yourself this question, it's very simple, but it's also really profound. And here it is. Will this matter in 6 years? Will this matter in 6 months? Will this matter in 6 days? If you want to get really microscopic with it, you can ask yourself, is this even going to matter in 6 hours? I think it's really important to just kind of look at the nature of our own minds. So, our minds overcomplicate things because that's what they do. They're just little processing machines, but sometimes that makes things harder than they need to be, especially when we're already kind of like wound up. Um, and so when we have this framework, we can help ourselves essentially unwind and we can live in an area, mentally at least, of simplicity. I don't remember the philosopher's name, but he said something like, most of the time people are not really disturbed by things. They're disturbed by their judgments of things. Another way this tool can be helpful is if we tend to take things really personally, because when we can shift out of personalizing or over personalizing, then we're in a state that's a lot more free and that's a lot more simple. I think we're all guilty of this too, but we take what is happening in the present moment and then we go so far into the future. And so we think, "Oh my God, because this is happening now, X, Y, and Z is going to happen later on down the road." We've all told ourselves that at some point, right? But this reframe can help get us out of that by asking ourselves, "Wait, is it actually true that this will matter in 6 years or 6 months? Like, maybe it's actually not true that this will matter." And then we get to go further and consider the ways that it actually won't matter, which can help us problem solve in the present moment. And, similarly, we kind of make these things that are happening in the present moment a bigger deal than they are when maybe they're just neutral. Maybe it's not all going to be the worst case scenario. And I just want to gently remind you that this is not your fault. If you're recognizing that these are some of your thinking patterns, it's totally normal. Our brains have so much going on all the time. A lot of us are in survivor mode, or when we get triggered, when something really agitates us and activates us, we go right back into that survival mode and start kind of falling into some of these thinking patterns, the catastrophizing. So that's why the 666 rule can come into play. It can be really helpful here. It can help you zoom out, see the bigger picture. It's awesome. Okay, so let's break down asking about 6 days. Will it matter in 6 days? It's helpful because it helps us distinguish between like our immediate concerns and our current discomfort. So in 6 days, like, yeah, we might not like what's going on, but it's actually okay. We're going to be able to figure this out. It gives us, some perspective on what is irritating us on the day to day, and it can help us avoid reactive decisions because if it is going to matter in 6 days, then you can kind of decide what you want to do without having to like rush into an action. You know what I mean? And if it doesn't matter in 6 days, then you don't have to do anything at all. So let's take the 6 months, for example. That can help us identify where we're like over investing emotional energy, because if it's not really going to matter in 6 months, why are we fretting so much over it right here? But then also, let's say again, it does matter in 6 months. Then we have to take strategic action and we have 6 months to get there before this, deadline that we're giving ourselves mentally. So then we can again create an action plan today, which is awesome. And it can also help us figure out which patterns are worth addressing, because maybe you discover that there are some parts of what you are worrying about that do matter. You might be able to sift out like, where is this pattern of worrying about things when you can create a plan? And then the long term view, is this going to matter in 6 years? This helps us get in touch with our long term values. And I realized this just as time has gone on, but thinking long term is actually a skill. When so many of us have lived in survival mode for so long, we're not thinking about the long term. So I like asking myself this question because it's a way that I can help myself practice the skill of thinking long term. Also, in 6 years, this can really challenge your ego, especially if you're kind of like me and you just wish you could have everything right away. You're impatient. So, this can challenge that part of you that is impatient, or just your ego based part of you. And it can help you get in touch with the authentic part of you, which is usually like somewhere else aside from the ego. And so, again, kind of in that values driven based place, it can let you know what really matters to you and how to approach that. That's where your energy conservation comes in. Because, again, if you have 6 years to get there, you can prioritize a lot of things when you have that much time. And I think that that is, again, a skill. I think that's really useful. And again, I think it also takes us out of this place of feeling like we have to have everything now and that we have to put this pressure on ourselves to get it right away, or like scheme and plot and manipulate in order to have what we want. So we're relieving ourselves from that like FOMO place, or that anxious, overwhelmed place. And we get to approach our problems and challenges from a place that's a lot more calm and grounded, which I think is great. And that does shift us into the psychological benefits of asking ourselves, will it matter in 6 years, 6 months, or 6 days? When we get into the habit of asking ourselves this question, we actually create pattern interruption. So we're breaking up some of that automatic stress and overwhelm that we might be conditioned to fall into. And again, this happens to me all the time. So if it's happening to you, it's not a problem. Like me, I just don't want you to stay there longer than you need to. And the right tools will help you get you out of that place. You have to break that pattern of just automatically thinking the worst case scenario, believing that thought, and then, taking action from that place. So we're creating a little bit of space between the stress and the response, right? The nerves firing in our mind, and then we're being like, oh, have to do something about it. I'm overwhelmed, or everything's going to fall apart. We're creating space between that initial reaction and what we do about it, how we act, how we function based on those thoughts and believing them. And because of that, you're letting the prefrontal cortex come online. So we're going to have that higher mind, that better thinking, the more rational line of thinking, which is always great for solutions, I think. We also have better emotional responses, right? So, better emotional regulation, because we're not reacting from stress. Our emotions are appropriately sized to the problems that we're facing. And when, again, we're kind of remaining in a little bit more of a calm state, you can be a little escalated. I'm not saying your heart rate won't kick up, or you won't have, rapid thinking. You might, but you're still appropriate, because if you're perceiving a problem, I think it makes sense to get a little bit anxious or stressed out. But you want to be able to bring yourself back down as quickly as possible and regulate exactly what I said, emotional regulation. But what else this pattern creates is reducing anxiety for future outcomes. Part of how anxiety is created in the mind and in the body is that we're thinking about the future, and typically we're thinking about it in an unproductive way. Again, we're catastrophizing, worst case scenario, thinking that we're inadequate to deal with the problem, the future problem, or that we're kind of mentally replaying from our past, actually, something bad happened. And then we're projecting that onto the future and we're creating an anxious state in the present moment. It's kind of wild, but we're reducing that anxiety in the present moment when we ask ourselves, hey, is this really going to matter in 6 years, in 6 months, in 6 days? And that builds emotional resilience, which is such an important skill. But if we're not practicing, then we're not going to build that skill. We're able to tolerate anxiety. I believe that most of us are, but if we were never taught how to do that, then it's definitely time that we start teaching ourselves and start practicing these things so that way we can handle like whatever life is throwing our way. And then, so the other thing we're doing here when we're using this perspective is that we are using cognitive flexibility because we're taking a lot of different perspectives. We have the perspectives of years, we have the perspective of months, and then we have the perspective of days. And from that, we get a lot of different information, that I already went over, and that gives us the ability to see our problem, perceived problem, from a lot of different angles. And I think that this is amazing. This enhances our problem solving ability, which, if you're like me, you really are solution oriented. You just kind of struggle getting to the solution. So you need frameworks to help get you there. And the 666 rule is a very helpful framework for becoming that more solution oriented, solution focused person. And then it also stops the rigid thinking pattern. So when our prefrontal cortex is offline, because we're in a high stressed state, we really don't think in a broad way. We don't have that higher mind online. We get into a cognitive distorted place, which is black and white thinking, this or that, instead of this, that, and maybe something else. So we're, again, just really creating a lot of amazing support for ourselves when we ask ourselves those simple questions. And this is a little more philosophical, but you know me, I'm going to go there. The 666 rule can help us like kind of get out of our minds and see the impermanence of everything, that things do change and they can change in 6 days, in 6 months, in 6 years. And that's actually okay. It helps us become okay with change, which is something a lot of us struggle to do, to adapt. This also helps us determine what we can and cannot control. And I think that that's so important in a time like today where we have people making insane power grabs, but then at the same time causing other people to really spin out of control. So I think now is the perfect time to be able to analyze accurately what we can and cannot control, what is within and without our realm of influence. I think too that this can help us better distinguish the difference between like events that are just happening and our interpretation of those events. We often, again, make them the worst case scenario, make them something negative about ourselves, automatically fall into overwhelm. Yeah, and in psychology, there's a set of irrational beliefs that we all kind of fall into. And one of them is that because, bad things are happening, I should feel horrible about them. And we don't always have to feel bad about every single thing that's happening in life, even the things that happen in our lives. Like, we don't necessarily have to feel bad about them because it could be happening in someone else's life and they don't feel bad about it. So my point is like a lot of our circumstances are, they're neutral. And if they were objective, then every single person around the world would feel bad about it because that is just the objective truth of that particular event or circumstance. And so I think it's just important for us to remember that we often do over personalize things and we do think we have more control than we really do. But it can help us connect with a larger, more temporal perspective of life. And again, I just think that's really necessary. All right, so let's talk about how to actually do this on the day to day, right? Because I'm gonna walk you through that. So let's practice the pause. Okay, you have to understand creating pauses in your life will help you when you're trying to go deeper in your self development practice. So here's what I'm going to say. If you haven't been practicing pausing throughout your day, you're going to want to start there. If you've already practiced pausing, you're ready for this next step, which is just taking those deep breaths. If you are already the person that is pausing and that is taking 3 breaths, ask yourself what really matters. Is this question or this worry that you have in your mind, sort of whatever's at the forefront of your mind? Ask it, is this going to matter in 6 years? Is this going to matter in 6 months? Is this going to matter in 6 days? And then you need to notice how your perspective shifts. The second thing you can do, if you're a journal girly, then you can just journal the questions. You just want to identify a single challenge. I think this is important because sometimes we can lump a lot of different things um, into sort of asking ourselves this reflective question, but that's not helpful. You want to identify things individually because things are just going to pop up differently. Like your answers are going to be different for each problem or perceived challenge that you're facing. So maybe you have more than one. Great, awesome. Write it down and then ask yourself, hey, 666, 6 years, 6 months, or 6 days. Write down what you are uncovering from asking yourself that question. And then notice if your responses kind of change over time. So if that problem is still sort of permeating your brain in the next week or so, ask again and see what happens. You can also do the future self check. So this is a fun little thought experiment. But in so imagine yourself 6 days from now, reflecting back on where you are in the present moment. What would they advise you? And how would they look at what you're thinking and feeling about your problems? Then you would go forward to the next 6 months. That's the version of you in 6 months is looking back on you today. What advice do they have? Same thing for 6 years. What advice do they have? This can be tricky. I think that this is a fun thought experiment, but I think you're probably going to extract better information, more concrete information, if you are practicing pausing, breathing, asking yourself that question, and or journaling on the question. So, the closing thoughts, I just want you to remember that this practice is not about invalidating your current experiences or emotions, because sometimes when we ask ourselves this, we think we're telling ourselves, my fears and worries in this moment don't matter. But that's not true. It's just really about giving yourself perspective to see if it is worth, worrying about. And maybe it is. Okay. Like your thoughts and feelings and your worry they're still there. Like you get to have them and work with them and understand, again, how they can move you into aligned action for yourself. But when we zoom out, we we just see a larger story. And I think that zooming out is such an important skill to have. There's other podcast episodes I can do about zooming in and when that's necessary, but these are all tools in our toolkit. So we're not going to like use a wrench to get a nail into a hole, right? We would use a hammer. So you want to make sure that you have like the right tools for the job at hand. And this is to help you get out of feeling overwhelmed and anxious. And again, that skill building of emotional regulation, cognitive flexibility, all those things that I mentioned. And I want you to have these skills. That's like the whole point of my podcast and educating people is so that they have frameworks to use so that they can, if you want this tool, you've got it in your toolbox. You've practiced it, you understand what it does for you. It's not going to land for everybody, but that's okay. You don't know if it's going to work or not work until you actually pick it up and try it. So that's what I'm going to leave you with today. This option, the 666 rule. Hopefully you do find it useful. Hopefully it does bring you the clarity that you are seeking. I will talk with you soon. Bye.